Dive Podcast, straight talk on politics, national security, and America's future. With Robert Johnson and Linda Miller, we cut through the spin, tackle the tough issues, and give you the real story behind today's headlines. Subscribe now and hit the notification bell to stay informed. If you're tuning in, you're likely trying to get a clearer picture of the complex situation around Ukraine and U.S. Russia relations.
And that's exactly what we aim to provide in this deep dive.
We're working from a specific source today, an interview given by the Russian foreign minister on April 27th, 2025.
Exactly. So let's start where the interview did with the attack on Kiev on April 24th.
Okay, what was the explanation given for that?
The minister stated very clearly, apparently, that the strikes only target military objectives.
Or civilian infrastructure being used by the military.
Precisely, and he referenced President Putin saying this repeatedly.
So the core message is, Russia doesn't intentionally hit civilian targets.
Yes, and he contrasted that with actions attributed to the Ukrainian government. The clarification was, if a site is used by Ukraine's military, then it becomes legitimate in their view.
For the Russian Ministry of Defense and commanders on the ground.
Right. And he pushed back against comparing it to, say, NATO bombing Belgrade in '99.
How so?
He characterized Belgrade as a deliberate attack on civilians, drawing a sharp line between that and what Russia says it's doing now, only hitting military-related facilities.
Okay, so that covers the targeting aspect. What about ceasefires? That must have come up.
Oh, definitely. He mentioned President Trump's proposal for a 30-day ceasefire.
And the Russian reaction.
Immediate support from President Putin, according to the minister. But, and this is crucial, with a big condition.
Which is?
Avoiding past mistakes. He specifically mentioned agreements that were signed, but then, in Russia's view, violated by Ukraine.
With alleged support from the Biden administration and European countries.
Exactly. He brought up examples, the February 2014 agreement, the Minsk agreements.
Those were meant to stop fighting in the East.
Right. And also the Istanbul agreement from April 2022.
So they're citing these as reasons for being cautious now.
Precisely. President Putin's stance, as relayed, is yes to a ceasefire, but they need guarantees.
Guarantees about what specifically?
That the pause won't be used to, well, strengthen Ukraine's military and that arms supplies will stop during that period.
Interesting, because the interview also mentioned Ukraine accepting a U.S. mediated ceasefire back in March without preconditions.
It did. But the minister explained Russia's hesitation stems directly from those past experiences, broken agreements, as they see it.
And he added something about EU and NATO statements.
Yeah, he highlighted comments from the EU High Representative and NATO's Secretary General suggesting they'd only back deals that make Ukraine stronger.
Implying that might not be what President Trump intended with his ceasefire idea.
That seemed to be the implication, yes.
So despite President Trump calling for a stop, the question was asked, will Russia keep attacking Kiev?
And the answer was pretty direct.
Which was?
That strikes will continue. Specifically on facilities used by Ukrainian military personnel, foreign mercenaries, and European instructors.
Instructors who they allege are helping attack Russian civilian targets.
Right. He gave the Kursk region as an example, claiming that over the last 6 months, Ukrainian shelling there hadn't hit any military sites, only civilian ones.
Okay. Let's shift to the energy infrastructure. There was talk of a moratorium there too, wasn't there?
Yes, another proposal from President Trump, a 30-day moratorium on attacking energy infrastructure.
In Russia's position.
Again, immediate support from President Putin, and the minister asserted that Russia has actually stuck to this commitment.
But they accused Ukraine of not doing the same.
Strongly. Claiming hundreds of Ukrainian attacks on civilian energy infrastructure during that supposed moratorium period.
And they documented this?
Apparently so. He mentioned a list of these alleged attacks was sent personally to Secretary of State Rubio and the UN.
Okay. Now, President Trump has said agreements are being reached. His envoy visited Moscow. How did the minister respond to that?
He acknowledged President Trump's view that progress is happening and stated Russia is ready to finalize a deal.
But it's not all sewn up yet.
No. He indicated some specific points, elements of the agreement, still need more work.
Did he confirm ongoing talks with the U.S.?
Yes, confirmed contacts about Ukraine are happening.
Anything else on the U.S. understanding?
He emphasized that, in their view, the U.S., especially President Trump and Secretary Rubio, understand the root causes of the situation.
Which, from Russia's perspective, includes?
NATO expansion, primarily, and also the rights of national minorities inside Ukraine.
Ah, the language issue.
Yes, he specifically mentioned what they see as the suppression of Russian language, media, education, and culture within Ukraine.
And he drew a contrast there, didn't he?
He did, pointing out the U.S. focus on human rights elsewhere, Iran, Venezuela, North Korea, China, versus what he called silence from Europe and the West on human rights issues in Ukraine.
He even mentioned the EU Commission president describing Ukraine defending European values.
And seemed to question if those values include, quote, cancellation of the Russian language.
One asked for actual details of any U.S. Russia agreement, though.
The shutters came down a bit. He said details of ongoing talks aren't discussed publicly.
And if you want Ukraine's view,
ask President Zelensky. That was the message.
All right. Let's talk about the Ukrainian children taken to Russia. That's a very sensitive point.
It is. The minister's response was that Russia had been working on this issue, children losing homes, families long before any request from Washington.
What did he say happened to them?
Most were placed in orphanages. He also mentioned an ongoing process involving Russian and Ukrainian ombudsmen.
Facilitated by whom?
Qatar, Saudi Arabia, and the UAE are helping, trying to return children to parents or relatives when they're located.
Did he confirm the numbers? Some reports mentioned thousands.
He said the exact number, the thousands mentioned by some experts advising President Trump, isn't known to them.
What about confidence-building measures beyond the ceasefire idea?
Well, he brought up that 30-day energy moratorium again, framing it as a measure Russia supported and followed, unlike Ukraine, in their view.
Anything else?
Yes, the renewal of the Black Sea deal for grain exports. He said President Trump's team proposed it. Delegations met in Riyadh to discuss implementation.
And Russian proposals are being considered by the U.S.
That's what he indicated, yes.
Okay, let's turn to sanctions and tariffs. President Trump has talked about potential secondary tariffs. How does Russia view sanctions now?
The minister avoided interpreting President Trump directly.
But on existing sanctions?
He repeated the line that Russia has adapted, restructured its economy. He even sort of hypothetically said he personally might prefer keeping them to avoid a sudden flood of Western services and tech.
But wasn't there a mention of a different view?
Yes. He acknowledged Kirill Dmitriev had suggested American companies might return later in 2025.
And Putin's view on that?
He referenced President Putin saying, essentially, Russia doesn't object to American companies, but those who left might find their spots taken by Russian firms or other foreign investors.
New projects would be considered based on?
A balance of interests. That phrase came up again.
Have they received any actual proposals for sanctions relief from the U.S.?
He stated no specific proposals have been received.
But they're open to business proposals?
Yes, if based on equal opportunity, mutual respect, and that balance of interests. He reiterated his personal view. Russia isn't afraid of sanctions and isn't necessarily asking for them to be lifted.
What about the bigger picture? U.S. intelligence apparently sees things tilting Russia's way in Ukraine. Why should the U.S. believe Russia is serious about peace?
The minister's response focused on the negotiations themselves. He said Russia judges the situation by the reactions of their U.S. counterparts in these confidential talks.
And he mentioned Secretary Rubio again.
Yes, pointing to Rubio's public statement about having a better understanding now of Russia's position and the reasons for the conflict. He contrasted this with the Biden administration, where he felt that understanding was lacking.
So the message is, dialogue is happening, both sides support it.
That's the takeaway conveyed, yes.
Is a Trump-Putin meeting actually on the cards?
Well, the minister deferred to the presidents themselves on scheduling.
But any hints?
He did mention President Trump had indicated a possible trip around mid-May, with date proposals expected.
And the location? Saudi Arabia was floated?
Acknowledged, but he also noted President Trump apparently indicated that's unlikely. So no real specifics confirmed there.
The use of personal envoys like S. Witkoff was mentioned. Any comment on that approach?
An interesting point was made. He noted there wasn't much concern voiced when the traditional diplomatic system wasn't fully used under the previous administration.
Implying criticism of that approach is selective now.
Perhaps. He also mentioned nervousness in Europe about being, quote, marginalized.
And tie that back to the EU stance.
Yes, referencing those EU officials who suggest any deal must ensure Ukraine wins. He questioned if negotiators with that mindset can find an honest balance of interests.
Contrasting that with the Trump administration supposedly being more interested in finding that balance and understanding Russia's view.
That was the contrast drawn, yes.
Okay. Couple more foreign policy points. What about relations with Iran? There's a strategic partnership agreement.
He stated plainly, no requests from the U.S. to break that relationship.
Did he comment on the U.S.-Iran negotiations?
Welcomed them, said Russia is ready to help if it's useful for both sides.
What about the old Iran nuclear deal, the JCPOA, and nuclear materials?
He clarified Russia's role in the original deal was storing some Iranian nuclear materials, not destroying them.
Would they offer to store the newly enriched materials Iran has produced?
He avoided answering directly, said Russia doesn't interfere in bilateral talks unless it's directly involved.
Right. Now, this issue of nuclear weapons in space, U.S. intelligence reports Russia developing an anti-satellite weapon.
His response was, essentially, verify U.S. intelligence claims first.
And Russia's position on weapons in space.
He highlighted Russia's long effort at the UN to get a ban on any nuclear weapons in space, an effort the U.S. opposed.
But the U.S. pushed for a ban on conventional weapons.
Yes, while not clarifying, according to the minister, if they plan to put nuclear weapons there themselves.
So Russia wants a legally binding UN ban on nukes in space.
That's their stated commitment, contrasted with the U.S. stance, at least under Biden. He said Russia rejects the satellite accusations and hasn't seen any proof.
Last couple of points. Arms control talks with the U.S., any prospect?
He pointed out the U.S. withdrew from the strategic stability process first.
So Russia might return if
The conditions are right, especially needing clarity on how Washington views the relationship. Are they an adversary or an enemy? Needs to be equal, mutually respectful dialogue, aiming for that balance of interests.
Someone must have suggested Russia hasn't offered any concessions.
He directly refuted that. Said Russia is ready to seek a balance of interests, both on Ukraine and in the wider U.S. relationship.
And finally, the U.S. Vice President mentioned a potential freeze at the current line of contact.
Again, the response was, negotiation details aren't public. What matters is Russia's actual position, not rumors.
Okay, I think that covers the main points relayed from the interview.
Yes, we've aimed to give you that first-person account, sticking strictly to what was recorded as being said.
Subscribe to our podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and YouTube. We are here to make things clear. New episodes every day.